Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and we're here today with special guest, Alice Lovejoy, who's here to share with us her new book, Tales of Militant Chemistry, The Film Factory in a Century of War. So what if the film that captured your memories held a story far bigger than the images it preserved? Well, today's guest is here to share with us just that. Alice Lovejoy is a film and media historian and a professor at the University of Minnesota. Trained in filmmaking, she spent years working as a film critic and curator in New York and Prague. Her writings have appeared in venues such as Reverse Shot and Film Comment, where she worked as an editor. So welcome to the show, Alice Lovejoy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. What even inspired you to write this?
This is a book that comes out of research that I've done for years, both on the history of film and on the history of film and the military, which is a history that really spans the world and spans all of film history back to the late 19th century. But the spark for this book in particular was finding a mention of Eastman Kodak's work for the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge, where the company separated uranium for the Y-12 plant. And that was a topic I wanted to pursue. And so that was the very beginning of the project.
Well, I can only imagine the wealth of research that you've done for this book. It's so very well written. Let's talk about Eastman Kodak. I mean, and their role in the 20th century industry and war. What was that like?
Yeah, so this is a company that we all know, right? We think about Kodak as a kind of myth in American culture and in global culture. It's the company that was behind the snapshot. It was the company that made it possible for you to photograph your children at home as they were growing up. During the war, during World War II, it became very well known for being a bridge between soldiers who were abroad and people who were at home in the US and elsewhere. So photography has changed a great deal in recent years. It's now really a digital business. It's on our phones, it's on our computers. But it was something that was physical, that was done on film with cameras for most of its existence. But there are other parts to Kodak's story and to the story of another film manufacturer that I follow in the book, the AGFA company in Germany. And these are parts of their histories that have to do with the chemical industry. And when we look at these companies through the lens of the chemical industry, we see different kinds of things that they made. They didn't only make film. They made things like rayon, the artificial fibers that might go into dresses or toys. They made plastics, they made pharmaceuticals, and they also made weapons. And that's an important part of the story for film manufacturers all over the globe, is that they were involved in, on the one hand, in World War II with making poison gas. And here I'm thinking of the French company Pathé and the German company AGFA. And then during World War II, like many, many private companies in the United States and abroad, they were involved in manufacturing the tools of war, whether these were steering wheel plastic, the plastic used to make steering wheels, or whether they were weapons in some cases.
Well, I was so intrigued by you have a distant relative that was an executive at Kodak. Can you share a little bit about that?
I can share a little bit. He is a very distant relative, so I don't know much about the family history here. But we are descended from the same family, and he was an executive who ran the company during World War II and was very involved in much of the 20th century history that the book explores, from scouting locations for new factories to helping devise ways of manufacturing for the company, and eventually to leading the entire business.
What a remarkable piece of family history to dive into.
Yeah.
This very unique connection in this book. And one of the things that your book reveals is this startling connection between Kodak film production and the Manhattan Project, like you mentioned. How did you uncover this hidden chapter of history?
Yeah, and this is one of the interesting things about the Manhattan Project is that after things ended, after the project ended, a lot of this wasn't a secret. A lot of companies were very proud of their role in helping end the war. And so there was a lot of material that is findable here, right? That is locatable. You just have to look for it. And so the history here is one that begins with Kodak's work making non-flammable safety film. Because one of the histories that the book explores is that early in its history, film was very flammable. The kinds of film used to show movies at a cinema, these films were made of something called cellulose nitrate, which is made of the same substance as nitrocellulose, which is an explosive. And so there were efforts early in cinema's history to make a kind of film that wouldn't catch fire so easily and that wouldn't burn for so long. And the factory that made the substance that Kodak came to here and that every other film manufacturer in the world came to, which is called cellulose acetate, that factory became very good at mass producing substances. And that mass production is what brought Kodak into the Manhattan Project, just as it brought other companies, other private companies in the United States into the project.
Well, I understand that the same time that Kodak was operating in the US, AGFA was operating in Nazi Germany. So, what role did AGFA play during World War II? And how do these parallel stories reflect a broader global industrial landscape of that time?
Yes, AGFA was part of the IG Farben chemical cartel, which is a name that is really notorious to us now. It was very involved with Nazi Germany's military-industrial complex, on a much larger scale, really, than in the United States. So we can't directly compare them. But AGFA was a company that was helping develop tools of war. It was helping doing military research. It was doing military research and development, and it was also at the same time continuing to make film for motion pictures and for still photographs. And this work, again, was linked up to the broader German chemical industry, which relied on forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners to make these products. And those products included film. So this is a landscape in which we can think of film as a big industry, right? As something that is made on the scale of any other large industrial product. We can't think of film only as something that's limited to the sphere of culture, right? Something that we watch on our days off or that we use as a way to unwind from the world. It was very much, and still is very much caught up in the world, a world that included in World War II a history of defense and war and violence.
Can you share with us the women that were working at the Manhattan Project?
So there were women who were working for the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge. A large part of Oak Ridge was staffed by women because they were not fighting overseas for the most part. And especially young women who weren't mothers yet in many cases or weren't married had what was seen as the time and the capacity to contribute to the war effort. So this is something that's been written about beautifully by Denise Kiernan and her work on women working at Oak Ridge, her book on women at Oak Ridge, and by other historians. But Y12, the factory that Tennessee Eastman operated at Oak Ridge, was staffed in large part by women who were really very good at their job.
So, what did the day to day work life look like for people who are working in film factories?
So the factory that I write about in the book, Y12 at Oak Ridge, was a factory that had numerous parts. It was immense, and there were many different sections of it. But the one where women most famously worked was operating the calutrons, which were the machines designed for uranium separation that had been designed in California at Berkeley, hence the name calutrons. And they were in charge of basically modulating the machines or operating a dial that would keep the machines operating at a steady pace. And as I discuss in the book, and as other historians have discussed, they were chosen for this because they were seen to be very good at the kind of precise manual labor that this required, where you had to be very attentive to detail and also very nimble with your hands. So these are assumptions that we could challenge in many ways and we could contextualize in many ways, but they formed the basis of the workforce and this particular part of the factory.
Can you share with us how this history is relevant today?
Yes, there are two things that I would highlight. So we live in a digital world. We've had a lot of discussion in recent years about the natural resources that make our digital world possible. We know there are rare earths and other materials that are mined or grown or extracted in other ways that power our machines. There are complex politics around this, around rare earths in particular, and there are really deep environmental and labor concerns around them as well. So one of the things that the book shows is that these histories go deeper into what might seem like a more innocent period in media's history, right? A moment of photographs and of multiplexes and of movies, the moment that precedes our digital present. So that's one takeaway, one important historical echo of this. Another thing to think about here is about the complex consequences of military industrial entanglements. And this is one of the stories that the book tracks. So there's a story in the book about what happened in 1950, 1951, when nuclear testing increased in the United States and abroad, and fallout became a concern, became an issue. One of the first companies to discover fallout at its physical plants, at its factories, was Kodak. And they discovered it because their X-ray film had little spots of radiation on it. And X-ray film is extremely good at showing radiation because that's how it's designed to work, right? In a medical setting, it's designed to use radiation to show an image on the film. So Kodak found this damage very early. It notified the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Atomic Energy Commission gave film manufacturers like Kodak privileged access to information about nuclear tests that would be happening in the future. Now, the same information was not given to people living around the factories or elsewhere in the United States. And this is something that has come up over and over the years, and certainly just this past week, this month, as we've had the dark anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. But it's a history that asks us to think about the consequences, again, of military-industrial entanglements. This is a company that had helped shape the bomb, but then was having to deal with the very real consequences of the bomb. And there's a larger story here also in how industry, in some cases, can matter much more than people. Over the course of US history, and what the consequences of this are. And these are questions that I think we need to think about today as well, in terms of environmental regulations that are being rolled back, and what the consequences of that will be.
Can you share a little bit on the military contracts that Kodak was involved with?
Yes, like other film manufacturers during World War I, Kodak was, and this was the same at AGFA, it was the same at the French company Pathé. They were involved with making what was called airplane dope. And dope here is a term that just means a viscous liquid substance. And this is a material that was designed to coat airplane wings so they would become weatherproof. Now, we have to remember that at this time, during World War I, airplanes had canvas wings, which, of course, are very vulnerable to rain and to snow. And what this airplane dope would do was cover the wings and cover the plane's body so it would be impervious to rain and to snow. And this substance was made from cellulose acetate, which became the non-flammable film that later became the basis of the home movies you might have taken on 16 millimeter or 8 millimeter. That same substance really had the beginnings of its industrial life coating airplane wings. So that's one. And then there were later histories of all film companies, including Kodak, working on optical devices, working on the kinds of films that would allow soldiers to communicate with their families more easily. So a form of microfilm that was called V-mail in the US context that would photograph soldiers' letters onto small frames of film, allowing them to travel much more efficiently and with much less weight back home via airplane. So those are just a couple of examples.
Those are such great examples, but just unique and interesting pieces of history when you pull that all together like that. And earlier you mentioned about just the toxic waste that was kind of the chemical byproducts. Can you share a little bit about that and the environmental harm it caused?
Yeah, so there's the story of Fallout on one hand, which is not a story of film manufacturing, but a story of the manufacturing of nuclear weapons and a story about atomic energy. But when we think of film manufacturing, we also have to understand that it was long and is still a dirty business. Many of the chemicals that film factories use are toxic, and all over the world, these are chemicals that over history haven't been disposed of in the right way or have spilled or seeped from factories to the world outside. So, most famously, in Kodak's case, the EPA and the Department of Justice mandated that the company do a major cleanup of its factory and the waterways around it in 2014. And the same is true in AGFA in Germany, in the factory I look at in the eastern part of the country, that there are histories of waterways being polluted by toxic runoff from the factory for many, many years. And this damage is still being remediated decades after the factory closed.
It's just interesting to hear the lasting impacts that these type of chemicals have had and that they're still dealing with it today.
It is. I mean, this goes back to one of the major points of the book, which is that making film was big business. It was something that was part of all of our lives, and just like digital media are today. You might have watched a film in a classroom. You might have gone to the movies. You might have used films in your business for instructional purposes. So there was a lot of film being made, and for many, many different purposes. And when we think of the industry on that scale, the environmental consequences start to look like the consequences of other kinds of industry, right? I'm thinking the automobile industry, the computer industry today. That these things have to be seen as industries in this sense, with everything that comes with that kind of production.
Well, given how central film and photography has been to modern life, why do you think that this part of the story has remained like untold for so long?
I think there's been wonderful work in film and media studies and in history and in the environmental humanities about this. And so this is work that has shown just how toxic film has been in many different ways. And that's talked about the resources and the energy that it uses and that digital media use. But part of the story that hasn't been told is the military side of it and how the military dimensions of making films, or the links between military manufacturing, the military industrial complex, and film manufacturing, link up with these environmental questions and with colonial histories as well. The histories of places where materials were bought to make film, gelatin, silver, cotton, wood, etc. So all of these histories are caught up with one another, and that's one of the stories that this book is trying to tell.
It was so intriguing reading the section about cotton in your book and just how that plays such an important part. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah. Cotton is a plant that has cellulose in it, right? And cellulose is the protein that makes up plant walls. And the cellulose in cotton is very useful, not just for making explosives like nitrocellulose, which we've talked about, but also for making film. And so the cotton linter seeds cotton linters, which are the fibers that attach to the cotton seed, were used to make film from its earliest years. The book looks at cotton through the case study of Tennessee Eastman, which was the chemical factory that Kodak founded in part to make safety film in the 1920s. And one of the reasons that factory's location was attractive to the company is that it was close to the places where cotton was grown in the South. So these histories, these agricultural histories, and racial injustice that have shaped the United States, shaped film manufacturing as well. And this is, again, something that historians of photography have written about beautifully as well.
Well, your book is just so in depth. Was there any piece of research that you discovered that really surprised you?
Yeah, I think one of the stories that was surprising to me was the story of poison gas. I did not expect to find the history of poison gas so closely tied to the history of film, both in terms of its chemical manufacturing and in terms of the ways in which the materials were seen as dangerous at a certain point in the early 20th century. Now, the reason for this goes back to film's flammability, to the fact that when it was made of cellulose nitrate, again, like nitrocellulose, it was extremely flammable and would routinely cause fires in cinemas or when it was being transported or when it was being stored, etc. And these fires got a lot of attention in the media, and they caused a kind of fear of cinema or a sense that it was somehow dangerous. Um, when World War I came around and poison gas became really the most horrible and visible weapon in that war, the links between the two media became very clear. And so we have the really formative moment in 1929, in May 1929, when the Cleveland Clinic fire, the famous Cleveland Clinic fire, which is, I think, to date, the most deadly hospital disaster in the United States, was sparked by Kodak's and other film companies' X-ray films that were stored in the hospital, which caught fire. And this is a moment that really brought together people's fear of film and the fires it could spark, and their fears of poison gas, which had emerged during World War II. And thinking about these two weapons together, I think, shapes a lot of the shared history that film and military materials carried through the 20th century.
Wow. That is just impressive how that all comes together. Your book is just so expansive in how you're bringing this all together, but you're touching on things that people wouldn't even think that have anything to do with film and the military. It must have taken you years to do all this research.
Yes, it was a wonderful process of research and discovery in, I think, 28 archives in multiple countries. And so it's a pleasurable process of trying to put the pieces together and figure out how they fit with one another. And it's a process that could continue as well, because this is a global story, right? This isn't just a story about the United States. It's not just a story about Germany. It's not just a story about AGFA and Kodak. It's a story about a kind of industry that shaped the 20th century in crucial ways, but that extends well beyond the realm of that century's cultural history and into its military history, its chemical history, its business history, et cetera. And so thinking of all of these things together was part of the process and the challenge and the joy in writing this.
Well, I can definitely see that it is something that you're very passionate about, being able to do this type of research and bring it all together, because you have such interesting information in here. I mean, we talked about Manhattan Project, we talked about some of the usage of the different materials, the chemicals. It's not just one thing. And then again, all across the globe, these other companies are in many ways where they kind of also mirrors of what was happening here in the US with Eastman Kodak?
It's a good question about where it begins and where the trends began. And I think the larger answer to that is that the film industry was always part of the chemical industry, and it evolved in ways that the chemical industry evolved. So following trends that had to do with diversification, or that had to do with histories of mergers between companies, or that had to do with what was seen as profitable and marketable at the time. Because of course, markets for products have always been and global in various ways, and this was certainly the case with cinema and with film. And so there was a long history of competition that plays out here. Companies competing with each other to make the best film and to sell the film to each other's countries, and trying to stop other countries from selling film to their own countries, that we can't think of in isolation. So whether it begins with Kodak or whether it begins with companies in Germany or companies in France, it's all tied together very tightly, and you can't pull one string without seeing the effects in another place.
Yeah, without a doubt. My goodness, it's all interwoven.
Absolutely.
What were the challenges that you faced when you were doing your research, especially on the global scale?
Yeah. So one of the challenges with writing histories of corporations like AGFA and Kodak and other large corporations is that their histories are large, the archives are not necessarily accessible, and so a lot of the work that I've done was to draw on archival sources in different places and of different kinds. So this includes the archives that I worked in, but also using oral histories and films and short stories and memoirs and newspaper and magazine articles to piece together the story. Like, this isn't a kind of story where you go to one repository and the history of a company and its products are in one place. So that's a challenge, but also an opportunity to look at our subjects in a global lens, refracted through multiple kinds of frames. And then the other challenge was delimiting where to begin and end the story, because a book can only be so many pages long, and this is a story that really does branch out into other companies, other kinds of materials, other kinds of colonial histories, military histories, environmental histories.
Now, did Eastman Kodak help you with any of their information?
I was fortunate to work in two wonderful archives in Rochester, New York, at the George Eastman Museum and at the University of Rochester's library, where they have excellent collections related to the company and excellent archivists working with these materials.
What would you like readers and our listeners to take away from your book?
I think one of the larger takeaways is to think about how we cordon off our cultural lives or our lives of entertainment or of whatever we're using our media today to do within a larger context, to think about how these media are caught up with the world, the kinds of histories of power that are embedded in them, the kinds of links that they draw between us and people on other sides of the globe, industries on other sides of the globe. And to think about how these webs and these links are created, not just through who we might be talking to on FaceTime or on WhatsApp, somebody who might be across the globe, but also through the materials that make up our media, the devices, through the kinds of manufacturing histories they have, which extend between countries and between industries. And to think of this work as work, to think of our experiences with media, not just as things that might isolate us or take us out of the world for a moment, but also really link us to the world in many different complicated ways.
Well, Alice, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Yes, you can find me at alicelovejoy.com. You can also find me on Blue Sky and on Instagram.
Well, Alice, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you for having me and for these wonderful questions. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, thank you, Alice. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Tales of Militant Chemistry: The Film Factory in a Century of War. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.